And we are going to be talking about a super exciting topic with an overlay into my own personal research, which I love. Megaliths is a wonderful, ever-giving subject of research for me, and it's great to be having somebody like Laird on the case over this part of the world. We're going to get into Skara Brae, Neolithic settlement, megaliths up in the north of Scotland, and that's Laird's forthcoming book. But to do Laird justice, as always, to a little bit of biography on him before I bring him on. He's an independent researcher of ancient cosmology and language, and his comparative cosmology studies have served to synchronize aspects of African, Egyptian, Vedic, Chinese, Polynesian, and other world cosmologies. And if you want to understand civilizations from truthful, alternative perspective, you need to come across Laird Scranton's research. Of course, Laird is probably most famous for the Dogon of all, I think, pioneering a massive wealth of research into the Dogon, which is how I think we've first come across Laird on Capricorn Radio. So I guess without further ado, let's bring on our guest. He is waiting. Hi, Laird. You're very welcome back to the show.
Hey, James. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me back on again, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you this August. In the British Isles, which will be a unique experience for me.
Yeah, for sure, brother. It's great to have you over this side of the world. And I'm looking. We've got a big conference in Avebury, Megalithic Heartland in Marlborough in Wiltshire. We're going to have lots of interesting megalithic researchers from all different angles, and it's like a pooling of information together. And I think the time is right for all this. I know we have another guy, Crichton Miller, there. And I think it gels a lot with your own research, that the seafaring thing, which I guess we'll probably touch a bit later in the show.
That's great. I'm looking forward to learning from the researchers there. You know, these are people whose work I've followed from a distance, and to have an opportunity to meet them is wonderful.
Yeah, that's the Megalithic Odyssey Symposium, and I guess it's like a think tank, Laird, and I that's what I love about shows like this. And it's been too long since we spoke anyway, but I know you've got this book coming out. I think the timing is perfect, and I think this show is like a think tank for me, and I feel selfish sometimes because I get so much out of it, and I know it's for the audience. So, but it's why I do what I do. I'm passionate about this subject matter, and I think that the origins of civilization is a very fundamental question, Laird, that everybody should seek. Because if you look at the political disarray on the planet at the moment, Laird, I mean, it's getting worse. I don't think it's getting better, and it may sound negative, but that's the reality of it. But I think
I agree.
I think people should question who they are in the past and understand it from a global perspective. I don't think there would be as many wars or religious, doctrines dominating.
No, I agree completely, and this is a wonderful time to be bringing up looking into topics of origins. But there certainly is a vibrant set of researchers who are doing that.
Sure. Of course, Laird, you've touched on the Dogon before, and we're going to bring in this aspect, but I guess why the migration up to North Scotland, for me, for maybe other reasons, all roads head to the Orkneys, and that's just in terms of megalithic art, because there's something special going on up there. But for you, Laird, why the migration up there for the research? It's in the middle of nowhere, Laird. People don't even know where this is.
No, I had no knowledge of the Orkney Island region myself. It really came out of a single question from a distant email contact who wanted to know if I thought there might be Egyptian influences at Skara Brae. And from my standpoint, 3200 BC, which is the era of Skara Brae, is too early to realistically have reflected Egyptian influences. That's pre-dynastic Egypt. Culture in Egypt wasn't coherent enough to really support the idea that they might have made excursions as far away as Scotland and were, exerting influences that far away at 3200 BC. But
sorry, I was going to say maybe the other way around, though, Laird.
Right. Well, my first perspective was that I know that the Dogon tribe, the African tribe from Mali that I've studied, indications are that in the era of 3200 BC, they were Egyptian, and they've done a very good job of preserving traditions. And I thought that if I had a shot of understanding Skara Brae, that it would be through comparison to the Dogon. If there had been Egyptian influences, I might see it in the Dogon. And so I didn't have great hopes when I started researching that I would find any connection whatsoever. That wasn't really my expectation. But as I got into looking at the situation, I realized there's not very much evidence to even begin with at Skara Brae. That it's fairly limited, but it doesn't connect to anything locally. I mean, the language and the pottery and the architecture and so on doesn't really connect to Scandinavian or local roots around the region of Scotland. You have place names that don't have linguistic roots, and you've got artifacts that don't really connect. And so I started sorting through. My first approach was to look at architectural forms. I know that the Skara Brae village, looked at in overview, is comparable to a Dogon village. I mean, it's theoretically possible they could have fallen in the same ballpark of architectural design. Similar style of construction using drywall stone construction, the placement of buildings in relationship to pathways, inner pathways, and so forth like that. It's reasonable to think that they might have come out of the same tradition. Sure. But there was another structure at Skara Brae which is sort of a rounded stone structure with a doorway built in a particular way. And I know that every Dogon village, part of the way they maintained their peaceful atmosphere was through the use of something called a discussion house that was built structurally very similar. The way the discussion house works is that in Dogon society, anytime there's a dispute, the people who are parties to the dispute are required to go to the discussion house and can't leave until they've resolved it.
Wow. Let me jump in there, Larry. So you're in an investigation mode at this point. You got suckered into this research and you realize, okay, I've nothing apparent here like, like a writing system or a hieroglyphs or any of that, that you could kind of tangible. But when you look at the complexity of the culture and their living habitat and everything, you realize that there is something there in terms of research, in terms of conceptual. Is that correct?
Right, and but I needed a positive link, and the positive link came out of the plan of the original Skara Brae houses. The stone houses that are there, I think there's only one left that wasn't rebuilt over the top of at a later point. But gotcha. It's understood that all of the original houses were built to the same plan, and it happens to be a match for a Dogon plan for a stone house. But the part that was valuable to me was that the Dogon plan connects to cosmology. There's a reason it's built to that plan. The structure of the house includes a round room at at one end, sort of a square main room with two rectangular rooms either side of that, and an entryway at the far end, away from the round room. For the Dogon, that represents the body of a woman. Actually, if you dig deeply enough into the cosmology, it's meant to be the body of a sleeping goddess. And the round room is her head, the square room is her main body cavity, the rooms to either side are her arms, and the entryway at the bottom represents her sexual parts. Wow. At Skara Brae, you also have a central hearth that represents the heart. And I thought it was very interesting that from my perspective, if we were looking at Egyptian influences on Scotland, that they had added this hearth in Scotland in keeping with the cosmological definition of the house. I thought that was very interesting because the Dogon don't have the hearth. It wasn't until later on that it occurred to me that I might be looking at things backwards, that the Skara Brae house might be the original and the Dogon house the duplicate.
How
and the
beautiful.
Dogon removed the hearth because in Mali they didn't need a hearth in a house.
Makes sense, and oh, wow. So I guess you're on this train then of research and it's kind of coming to you. It's not just a simple thing. It's just levels of complexity that are kind of mirroring each other.
Yes, that's true. And the more cultures that I've compared, the easier it is to try to sort out one I haven't seen before. So now having the link of the architecture suggesting a link to a particular system of cosmology, I'm now in a position to interpret the megalithic sites that are on Orkney Island in terms of that same cosmology. We have a series of sites that essentially form a spiral around a body of water. They were connected by a road in Neolithic times that led to Skara Brae. And those sites fall right in line with the cosmological definitions of the Dogon. These represent progressive stages of creation in an understandable way. I mean, we can describe how language defines what these sites represented. The shapes represent a particular thing, and in sequence with each other, you have a strong argument that we're talking about a cosmological progression.
Wow, this is amazing, Laird. Okay, so maybe just stop for a moment. Let's break this down for the listeners, because Neolithic and megalithic. I have trouble just explaining this to people who are aware of this stuff. Neolithic, the new Stone Age, is basically the era, and the megalithic is typically the constructions like the stone circles and the mounds. However,
that's right.
So we called Skara Brae a Neolithic settlement because it was that era that it was found. But most likely, we can make the conclusion that the people who built the megaliths lived at Skara Brae. Would that be correct?
Yes, it was the same society of people, whether it was the actual who they believe were farmers living at Skara Brae who raised these monuments, or whether it was a larger group in the region who raised the monuments is, no one can really answer. But yes, it was the same culture that put up the megalithic sites over a period of 600 years.
These namesakes get very confusing for people. I mean, you say the word megalithic to people, even in Britain and in Ireland, most of the people don't know it. They just get confused, and it's megalithic, Neolithic, and really megalithic could be anything big stones. But we're talking about the megalithic culture of Europe here, which really did span from North Scotland right down to Malta, from the northwest of Ireland right to the Middle East. So we're not, you must look at this as a whole. This is what I try to do. This is my thing. I'm trying to raise awareness and attention to this, Laird, that we're not just talking, a few things in Britain, because Britain and Ireland's famous for the Stonehenge and the Newgrange and Maze Howe, and we have famous monuments here. But nobody looks at this as a unified megalithic culture of Europe who had all the same knowledge. So it's like we're spreading out now from Orkneys to British Isles and down to like the bottom of Europe.
That's right, and in a coherent way with forms that we can relate to one another, and that we can use bring other evidence to bear to tie them together.
So we're not too far away from Egypt, Laird, with the megalithic Europe. When you migrate the coastlines down, when you migrate those coastlines, I mean, from the Orkneys, it's not an abstract idea. It's quite tangible.
No, it is. It's very tangible, and there are references that Egyptian references that make it sound like there were connections between the locales in later eras. In ancient Greece, certainly there were.
Wow.
Herodotus reports stories of sailors who sailed out through the mouth of the Pillars of Hercules and northward from there. Sounds like they made it to the Orkney Island region.
Really?
So it's not unthinkable that these things happened. We also know that the Egyptians had seagoing vessels that were quite capable of making that kind of a journey.
This is amazing. Well, it makes sense to me, and bringing in a seafaring aspect, and I think this is pertinent, because, we're talking the Orkney Islands. They're just within the Orkneys themselves, they're a large collection of small inland waterways and islands. They must have been seafarers getting to and from little islands there, and then to the mainland of Scotland as well. These guys had to have done this all by boat. They're boat people, if you want to call them that. There must be a boat culture or a seafaring culture.
Right, although it's not clear in ancient times what happened with those waterways, what kind of land connections there might have been to Europe, and so forth.
Sure.
So there may have been earlier connections that were not by boat.
Gotcha. Okay, paint a picture for the audience, Laird, just on the history of Skara Brae. I know there's a very interesting story of how it was found, and maybe just kind of give us like a top-down elevation if you want to describe it, and kind of paint the population there. Paint a picture for us.
Okay, shortly after 4000 BC, there were family farms in the Orkney Islands. It's understood that families were farming little farms. Skara Brae, from the traditional viewpoint, around 3200 BC, represents the first organized farming village. It consists of 8 chambered houses that might have housed 8 families. There are estimates of up to maybe 20 families that might have lived there at any given time. We know they were farming there. We can see that they had some fishing skills and things, but didn't seem to make a living, did not support themselves through fishing. They were domesticating animals, farm animals, and things like that. But they were also, over a period of 600 years, creating a set of related stone structures, these large megalithic stone structures, that, from my standpoint, had to have been developed from a single plan that crossed generations. Now, sometime after 2600 BC, the site was deliberately abandoned and abruptly abandoned, and then covered over. Some say naturally, and some say that deliberately covered over by people. But it remained covered for some 4,000 years until around 1850. I think in 1850, a series of storms hit the island and uncovered a piece of the Skara Brae village on the land of the Laird of Scale.
The Laird of Scale, wow.
He spent the next 8 years of his life and a large part of his fortune excavating and trying to preserve the site, because he understood the importance of it.
Laird, we're talking latitude 59 degrees here. This is like not the habitat you want to be doing this stuff, but do we have any reasons why we're seeing such an important culture? I mean, they call this like one of the most awesome preserved sites in the whole of Europe for research, for archaeology. It was such a rich culture there and complex. We just don't expect to find it up, so it's just a cold terrain. Do we know anything? Was the climate maybe different, or had these guys a reason for being there?
I expect that the climate was warmer at that time. I mean, for it to have fostered agriculture in that region, and for centuries to have easy agriculture happening there, the climate must have been somewhat warmer than it is today.
Yeah. I know you're going to be going there in August, Laird, and Tanya, it's not a pretty picture there. Even in the summertime, it can be pretty brutal and rough. So, okay, for me, when you telling me that you uncovered this stuff, Laird, the site was covered over and then it was uncovered in a storm. I mean, this kind of brings back Göbekli Tepe or other places that were, even Gavarnie in Brittany in France, the megalithic place was decommissioned, quotes. Is this a case that was decommissioned, Laird? Do you think it was a decommissioning process?
I think that the people who were living on the island were in a position of having to leave abruptly. There are sites nearby. There's a village of Brodgar there where a final feast occurred just before they left. They can see that at least 400 animals were slaughtered for this feast, perhaps by farmers who knew they were leaving permanently and didn't want to leave farm animals behind to just starve to death. They can see that at least 1,000 people attended this feast. But when the feast was finished, again, they deliberately covered over the site, but before they covered it, they left bones set carefully all around the site of the feast. But not just any bones. They left only shin bones of animals.
Really?
Now that symbolism works in some of these ancient cultures is through homonyms, the use of homonyms. And the farther back in time you go, the more commonality of language you have. One of the things I've had success doing for the Orkney Island region is comparing native words there to Egyptian and Dogon words. And in the book that I've written, there's all sorts of correlations between words back and forth to explain why a site was named what it was. So using the Egyptian dictionary, we can see that the word for the shin bone of an animal is a homonym for a word that means to leave under duress, to leave under dire circumstances. They had to leave, is what they were saying.
Wow.
Also, a deer carcass over the top of the site before they covered it, and the head of a bull on top of that. Now, Egyptian words that tie to the deer and the bull head or the cow's head also tell us some things about the site. It looks as if the site was deliberately covered over, but the Egyptian word that applies is written with a series of glyphs that sort of act out the daily ritual that happens in Judaism when they cover and tie a scroll after it's been read. and that's a ritual act. The spiral of structures that lead to Skara Brae create a cosmological form that's known as an arc. Now, when in Judaism every day, when they have finished reading the Torah scroll and they roll it up and they cover it and tie it and place it back in a cabinet, the cabinet is called the Aron HaKodesh, and phonetically they abbreviate that to ark. So by covering it, they've essentially named it for us. There's an Egyptian word that means to cover over that's pronounced ark. There's the symbolism of the word for cover over that shows us the steps associated with an ark. They're telling us symbolically that the site was an ark. We have similar things happening at Göbekli Tepe. At Göbekli Tepe, one of the claims is they covered it over to protect the site from natural events. But on Orkney Island, we don't have that consideration. It doesn't look like the sites themselves were in danger.
Ceremonial ritual protection of the site.
Right, and the things that were covered were not the large megalithic structures. So clearly they weren't trying to protect those for posterity or for any other reason, protect it from natural circumstances or whatever. This was a ritual act, and from a ritual standpoint, what it says to me is, if you compare it in parallel to what happens with a Torah scroll in Judaism, what it says is that the instructional purpose of this site, just like the instructional purpose of reading a portion of a Torah scroll, was completed properly, and that they had deliberately closed it up and tied it up and put it away as a ritual act, indicating that the instruction was brought to its proper conclusion the way they intended it to. That they weren't interrupted in the middle of it.
Incredible, Laird. I'm already only talking in the show 30 minutes halfway through, Laird, and it's already compelling. You're painting a very compelling episode in history here that links to previously unknown elements.
Now, there's another aspect to the site that's very important to me. We have a series of structures that I say represent stages of creation, sequential stages of creation. That begin with a standing stone, the watchstone of Stennis, and then lead to a stone circle, the standing stones of Stennis, and then to a mound, which is Maes Howe, and then ultimately to Skara Brae. There are other stages in between, but then to Skara Brae, which represents a cluster of 8 chambers. This is a cosmological progression that we can recognize, but the progression doesn't end at the 8 chambers for the Dogon. It continues on several other stages, and the next stage is represented by an agricultural field, which we know was associated with Skara Brae, and that field is associated with the high priest of the Dogon culture called the Aru priest. And every year before they plant the agricultural field of the Aru priest, they make ritual drawings in the field that represent things that relate to the formation of matter. So the suggestion is that the agricultural field also pertained to this progression. In Dogon culture, it's called the field of the Aru priest. In Egypt, the word for field is seket, and so the proper term for the same concept is seket eru, which is an Egyptian term for their underworld. It's the field of reeds where they represented their concept of heaven. It's written about in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's the Elysian fields that are represented as heaven in Greece. Now, in each of these cultures, this field is dealt with on 2 levels simultaneously. It represents a mythical concept, but it also represents an actual physical agricultural field in a real world locale. And all of the descriptions we get out of Egypt and out of ancient Greece of the Elysian fields or the field of reeds are all correct descriptions of what we would have found at Orkney Island in the day they were describing it. They're talking about an island with white sand beaches, and we're talking about a place of great winds. We're talking about a place located on the far western edge of the continent of Europe, or the far eastern side of the Western Ocean. we have lots of connections. They even refer to it as Pindar refers to it as Okeanos. So we would have phonetic connection to the name of Orkney Island. The term Orkney Island was referred to in ancient times as Argot or as Orkneyar. Argot, in the phonetics of the cosmology, refers to the ascending stages of creation, which is what those stone structures represent.
Mm-hmm.
Orkneyar has a slightly different perspective of meaning. A boat that was coming through the North Atlantic would be carried by currents northward, just north of where the Orkney Islands are, and then the currents swing around and bring it back towards Orkney Island and then down towards Ireland. The word Orkneyar in the phonetics of these traditions means to approach what I interpret as being Ireland by boat. The name for Ireland, E-I-R-E, is for me a correlate to the term for Orkney Island, which was Aru, A-R-O-U in the Dogon, as the Dogon represented, or in Egypt was A-A-R-U phonetically.
Wow. And it's funny, we have that idea of the Elysian Fields in the Irish mythology as well, which was preserved from probably megalithic. I mean, they talked about the people of the mounds, the Tuatha De Danann, or the Dinashee, she being a mound, the people of the mounds, that they had this idea of the other world as well. This is the Elysian Fields, comparative to Greece. But you would expect to find this, Laird. If what we're saying is true, you would expect to find the fragments surviving in all these different places in maybe different ways or different interpretations, but the core fragment should be there.
That's true, and language is one of the keys for being able to tie them back together. Symbolism of structures is another way. I mean, we know about the symbolism of the Temple of Man in Egypt, which represents, according to Schwaller de Lubitz, represented the body of a person. That's a correlate to the same concept of the Scarabray house. There are famous myths in the Hindu tradition and in the Egyptian traditions about that relate to journeys through 7 houses. Well, it looks to me as if they're not just talking about houses generically, they're talking specifically about those 7 houses, the 7 houses that we find, the 7 or 8 houses that we find at Scarabray. Lots of interesting connections to be made through myth and through language and through other means.
Larry, just take one little moment there. I know the book is for pre-order. It's available this November. I'm so excited. This is one of my sought-after books. It's not even on the shelf yet, but I can't wait to get this one there. But I know it's up for pre-order on Amazon. Just take a moment, give out the exact name of the title and the subtitle as well.
Let's see. It will be referred to as the Mystery of Scarabray. And actually, I don't have the publisher's subtitle.
I will give you that. It's the Neolithic Scotland and the Origins of Ancient Egypt. And so just for the audience, if they want to check in on that.
My working title for the boat had actually been called The Overthrown Boat. And the reason it's called that is because the concept of an overturned boat is important cosmologically to the site. Scarabray ties to Egyptian, the name Scarabray ties to Egyptian words that mean overthrown or overturned boat.
Wow.
And one of the chapters in the book is about the concept and how that relates. So publishers like to assign their own names. I actually happen to like the name The Mystery of Scarabray. I think it's a better title than what I was working with.
Yeah, no, and I love the cover as well. And of course, people can find that on the Inner Traditions website, who we host on the show quite regularly. I just love the research that you do, Laird, and I love the way you're like a detective. You're like Kev Baker says, the cold case detectives are out there on all these ancient sites now, and they take the evidence that they've got left, and all of a sudden, you're looking with a very clear perspective on something, and it's a difficult task, Laird. It is. We're up against it. I mean, most of, it'd be great if all the evidence was there, but unfortunately human tradition doesn't let us do that. And geology and weather and the ravages of time, it leaves us very little sometimes. But sometimes, we're living in a different era now where we have a lot of, the internet age has changed everything. We've got comparative ways of doing things now that we could never have done before. And I just think it's wonderful because we're looking at a very, very interesting episode here, Laird.
Yes. Now, around 100 years after the Skara Brae site is founded, suddenly we see appearing all around the world in 4 different locales agriculturally based kingships. And we see one in Egypt that was referred to as Taru. We have one in Ireland that I refer to as Aru. Mm-hmm. One in China that you could call Iru. And one in South America you can call Peru.
Wow.
Now, from a linguistic standpoint, those terms, those prefixes, ta, ar, ir, and pe, and the larger terms also have several sets of meanings. On one level of interpretation, they represent the 4 cardinal points of the globe, and we're talking, north, south, east, and west, China, South America, Egypt, and Ireland. They also represent 4 progressive stages of an agricultural field. They represent an unplanted field, a planted field, a field with crops growing in it, and granaries where harvested grain is put. Wow. There's several other levels of interpretation for those words that all tie. Back in the day of Göbekli Tepe, the high mountaintop sanctuaries, mm-hmm. One of my impressions has been that the one reason why they were placed in high mountaintop locales is as a way of providing protection for a group of mythical teachers who were said to have been bringing civilizing skills to humanity. Now I go to Orkney Island, and I see here we have a sea level site, locale, that's easily accessible by ocean, easy harbors, no natural protections whatsoever at the Orkney Island site. And I ask myself, so where would the safe haven be for the teachers? Mm-hmm. And the easy answer I come to is just across the waters to the north and west is a group of islands called the Faroe Islands. And the Faroe Islands have all sorts of natural protections. They're characterized by sheer cliffs that rise 200 feet into the air from the water that ships would smash against and make it difficult for a boat to land. They have channels that include whirlpools that could sink a boat, or where twisting storms will come through almost daily that could sink a boat. There are shoals on the far side that a boat could run up against. There are all sorts of natural protections there for somebody who was on top of the island as a place of refuge. And we have structures on top of those islands that look for all the world like pyramids.
Mm. Wow. This is incredible. So, funny you mentioned, just as a throwback, and when you mentioned the agriculture in Ireland, we have a place, I don't know if you're familiar, called Cada Fields. You know Cada?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think this is probably the place we're referring to then. Bizarrely, they've put a pyramid visitor centre there where Cada Fields is. But it's a Neolithic agricultural settlement where they basically flat-topped the whole hill overlooking the coast in Mayo, in the middle of nowhere. And they just literally flat-topped the whole giant hill. And most people don't even refer to this. It's just some forgotten place.
Well, then at around 2600 BC, about the time the Skara Brae site is abandoned, you have interesting things happening in Egypt. You have, first of all, you have a set of rulers there who are referring to themselves, or actually originally their place of where they lived, as Pharaoh. You have a pharaoh who comes to power called Sene-Pharaoh. Those are phonetics that mean image of or reflection of Pharaoh, who starts building pyramids in Egypt that look an awful lot like peaks you see in the Faroe Islands. You have a peak of Kunoi that makes a change in angle as the mountain peak rises. That is a pretty close match for the bent pyramid that Sene-Pharaoh built.
Sene-Pharaoh's bent pyramid I have been to, Laird, and I just know that there's some bizarre reason for doing that. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. I mean, you don't just want to turn up one day and build a pyramid and then turn around. No, we'll change the angle halfway up. It's a difficult thing to do.
Right. Now, then you also have in Egypt, about that same period in time, the names of the pharaohs had previously been enclosed in something called a serech, which is supposedly a representation of the facade of a palace. But around 2600 BC, they switch it, and now they suddenly start enclosing the name of the glyphs of the name of the pharaoh in what's called a cartouche, which, according to Budge, originally represented the concept of an island. So now you have
Wow.
You have agents of the pharaoh referring to themselves as pharaohs, and the term pharaoh being very important. You have schools established associated with every temple that are teaching all the same concepts that I've inferred must have been taught on Orkney Island leading up to that. It looks as if there was a continuation of education in the temples in Egypt. You have a goddess rise to prominence named Seshat. Now, one of the Egyptian terms for that deer carcass that was laid over the top of Brodgar is pronounced Sesha. It refers to the concept of knowledge and refers to concepts of instruction.
It's incredible. Laird, maybe I'll throw this one out there. Maybe they guys had sunken landmass in the Atlantic or whatever. They came from some unknown region and they came to the Faroe Islands for safety. They were very, very high mountain peaks that look like pyramids, obviously, but maybe they came there and waited for the dust to settle, as we say, or the maybe there was ocean problems, rising sea levels, stuff like that. Maybe they've lost their lands in the Atlantic. Maybe is that a
that may be. I mean that may be the truth, and I don't have anything that argues against that perspective. The Dogon actually refer to a time when humanity was restored to culture, which implies that there were high cultures before. So that's a perspective. When you get back down to the bottom of the traditions that I research, that's not the primary thing they say is going on. The primary thing they say is going on is that humanity had non-human help in establishing civilization, and there's some fairly compelling rationales that are a book or two down the line for me.
Wow.
Why that happened.
Well, I know. I've covered all sorts in this show, but I know that the Dogon, the Nummo and the Dogon, other cultures too, but particularly, it's an incredibly interesting aspect. I think most people tiptoe around it and don't want to address it. So I guess that's a courageous research ahead of you, Laird.
Well, one of the images in the book that's coming out that I provide is a comparative image between a Druid priest and a Dogon priest. And it's an intuitive match. I mean, the reader will see that very strong similarities between the two.
Incredible. So, Laird, you're working on another book as well, aren't you? This is pretty much done. This is A Mystery of Skara Brae.
Mystery of Skara Brae is at the publisher. I'm actually 2 books beyond that now. I have the follow-on to the Skara Brae book is really about the Maori in New Zealand, and I see the Maori, actually the Maori and a group of pygmies similar to what are reported in Ireland, who built the equivalent of fairy mounds that we find in Ireland
and Sardinia too.
Scotland,
and Sardinia too,
New Zealand.
Yeah, they say
yes.
they say that the little chambers in Sardinia were, they call them Domus de Janus, basically, which is translated as the House of the Fairies, and they have the same mythology in Sardinia as they do in Ireland. And I tell you, Laird, I'm 6'3", and I would need to be half of my height to get inside some of these rooms. That's how small they are.
Well, and again, the term fairy is based on the phonetic pharaoh, or similar phonetics to pharaoh. So we have some commonality happening there. But the New Zealand book describes all sorts of connections between Ireland and New Zealand, and lots of descriptions of Maori culture and Maori cosmology and Maori language that actually ties to every era that I've studied, ranging from 10,000 BC right up until the period around 1500 BC in New Zealand,
of course,
1580 in New Zealand. Then beyond that, there's another book that's almost finished that deals with fundamental concepts of creation from a cosmological standpoint and a scientific standpoint. These are concepts that aren't dealt with in, at least not yet, in terms of string theory and prevailing theories of how matter forms. They're consistent with those theories, but they actually precede them. One of my problems is that I can lay Dogen concepts of how matter is formed side by side with string theory and see an intuitive match from bottom to top. But the Dogen also include certain stages that are prior to that science doesn't have a correlate for yet.
Wow, I know this little aspect from John Anthony West's documentary Magical Egypt. I know you touched on it there, and I think that was the first time I came across your work, Laird, when you were talking about this similarity. It's bizarre to people, when you say the punchline that either, string theory in ancient times or something like that, and a correction, that's all they see, and they run away from the idea. However, the evidence speaks for itself, and everything about string theory and quantum physics is exotic, counterintuitive, and really it beckons that we have like another world that we just don't even see or know, and we can't logically rationale it into any comprehension.
And the details of that other world are so intimately entwined with the basic symbolism of these systems that you and I are exploring. And researchers, including myself, for 20 years I would go without even noticing that there were fundamental aspects of this that nobody was ever considering. There were questions that nobody even bothered to ask. For example, the concept of sacred geometry. Everybody knows, and everybody in our field of study knows about the concept of sacred geometry.
Yeah.
But none of the researchers I've ever come across bothered to ask, could that be the geometry of something?
Laird, I know I've got you in Ireland for a little spell coming up in August, and I'm going to take you to some rock art, megalithic rock art, probably, it must be somewhere in the period 3000 to 3300 BC, something in that window, and it's the exact replica of a d orbital shell, and I know you covered that in Dogon cosmology because I've seen megalithic art. It's the exact cloud diagram for a d orbital shell, which is a quantum physics for the audience. It's a quantum physics diagram, and it's just sitting there exact same in the rock art in Loughrew in Ireland.
Well, yes, and when I come in August, I'll walk you through the major steps of this this whole structure at the bottom of what we're talking about. It's really interesting stuff. But when you understand it, it provides a rationale that makes perfect sense for why things like the esoteric tradition were created and why the progression of sites in different eras appear the way they appear around the world.
Yeah, and that's a very important point, Laird. I think that's what this is why I think there was a return to esoteric or this philosophical and oral languages, and writing was obsolete because of maybe it's a cataclysm, maybe it's not. Maybe something has happened in our past that it scrubbed us almost from the record and we survived it. But I think the preservation of knowledge through oral traditions, art, and philosophy, and putting that into a monument, yes, but not having the written text. I mean, written texts are no good if you get a hit with a tidal wave. What good is written text going to do? But the brains are the computers, and they're the ones that hold the knowledge through various, and like you say, and I know you talk about the checkpoints in every story in the oral history and how important that is.
Yes. One of the big surprises to me is the Dogen compare this cosmology to layers of skins of an onion, that you peel one back and you find the next one, you peel that back, you find the next one. I've experienced this myself, that every time I finish a book, I think I'm at the bottom of the system. And then I realize there's a whole other level to it that I didn't recognize. Well, moving upward, conceptually, there's also whole other levels I didn't realize were there. It never occurred to me that the esoteric tradition itself might be symbolic of something.
Yeah. Wow.
Really interesting stuff anyway.
Yeah. Laird, there's a place in the Shetlands called Jarlshof. I only came across it recently myself. It looks
yes, I've seen photos.
It looks like Skara Brae somewhat.
Yes, it does. It looks to me as if that is one of the places that a group fled to after 2600 BC when they abandoned Orkney Island, that one group might have gone there.
Yeah. Of course, again, it's in the same district or region, which was why I mentioned. The ground plan, Laird, or maybe I'm seeing things that aren't there, but the ground plan is very interesting. I think it looks like the Pleiades as you look down from it, but I could make anything out of it, I suppose, if I wanted to. Do you see any representation of the ground plan matching star constellations or anything like that?
I haven't really looked into that, but it's always a possibility. Anything that people could see in the night sky was fair game for representation symbolically.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just the ground plan is interesting, but again, it's very difficult to see. I definitely think it looks like there's a cluster of stars there, the Pleiades, which were obviously important to the Dogon, but it could be reaching.
The trick with interpretation is, the problem is that the human mind is wired to see patterns.
Yes, exactly.
And so the trick with an interpretation is to find a way to anchor the thing that you're trying to chase. And the way that I typically do that is I find a clear statement on the part of the culture that I'm studying that says they believe that this thing represented that. And then I pursue it. It's a little harder when you are in an era that precedes written language. Then you have to find other ways of demonstrating intention. For example, the Skara Brae house. Skara Brae house made it sound like we're talking about a particular cosmology. We verify that by looking at the other structures on the island and see that they make sense in terms of the same cosmology. Now we have an anchor. So results by themselves are problematic for me because I can see a pattern in something that might or might not really represent what the people there thought.
Gotcha. And when you spoke about the heart earlier, I was in Tarjan Temple in Malta, and I took a snapshot of at one angle of it just looks like Skara Brae. If you didn't see the surrounding temple above ground, you just zoomed in on where the little hearts were and the little room. It just screams Orkneys to me.
As I recall, I think the city plan of Malta itself, the original city plan, was a correlate to the Skara Brae house.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. Wow, Laird, you don't stop going. You've got another 2 books in the pipeline. How do you get time to do this? This must be a passion to you, Laird, this truth to knowledge.
Well, it is, and also over time, I mean, as you probably know, as you're researching things, working through a particular source, you might come away with a handful of facts that are useful to you, and a box full of facts that might or might not be useful, that you don't know what to do with.
Yeah.
Well, as I've been researching these books, I've ended up with so many loose ends that don't necessarily connect to anything, and then suddenly the right piece will come along and pull a book's worth of those together in sort of one go.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to do it. Is you still sometimes have to put stuff on the shelf, and that's admirable that you do that, Laird. Laird, I guess what do you want people to take away from this book? I mean, people that are interested in Neolithic, megalithic, origins, everything. I guess there's a lot in there.
I think the important point for me is that I see several eras of influence on cultures like ancient Egypt. I see influences at 10,000 BC during the era of Göbekli Tepe. Imagine the Sphinx. If you accept the idea that the Sphinx pointed to Leo in the era of 10,000 BC, or that the pyramids pointed to the belt stars of Orion in that same era, those alignments had to have happened in 10,000 BC. Otherwise, we have to assume that some culture was able to calculate them retrospectively, which I don't think is reasonable. So we have 10,000 BC era influences in Egypt. We have another set of 4,000 BC era influences that seem to have passed through India and up into Egypt at Elephantine, and a third set of influences that seem to have come in from Scotland around 3000 BC or 3100 BC. The pivotal point for this new book on Skara Brae is, I think that based on Dogon references and references from other cultures, that Skara Brae represented a training site, and that 100 years later we found agricultural kingships, all based on very similar concepts to one another, all associated with lions, or with whatever, like in South America, it wasn't actually a lion, it was probably a puma,
Wow.
that all arise at the same moment in human history for no apparent reason. It looks to me like those were instructed.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. You know, and for me, I guess a number of years ago, I used to compartmentalize all my research, Laird. You know, I'd be interested in Egypt and I'd be interested in Irish stuff. I'd be interested in megalithic, and you know, I kind of compartment just for my own sake, my own. But I guess my growth now is I see the ancient world as none of it separated. It was all the waterways of the world were linking everything up, and I know from your research at Eyal and many others that you know that seafaring is a major element. Of course, seafarers are cosmologists. They're looking at the stars and they're trying to understand them for their navigation. And I just know that from other researchers who focus on that. That implies, you know, high technology or use of high concepts. Again, where did they get all this from? It's a quite evolved, and all of a sudden you're down this very, very complex origins of humankind.
Yes, and from my perspective, they all interrelate. But then from Freud's perspective, they also all he could see that they interrelated. He had archetypes that he couldn't explain why they were the same in every culture. He had to postulate psychology to explain it.
Sure. Wow, so interesting. Laird, I'm looking forward. We're going to speak together at the Megalithic Odyssey Symposium in Marlborough College in Wiltshire. We're going to do like a little megalithic tour as well on the next day. Looking forward to having you in the UK. We're going to be in Avebury, and we're going to be up in the Orkneys as well, and the Faroe Islands as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing you over this part of the world, brother. I'm looking forward to seeing this on the shelf. I think this is one of your most exciting books, yeah, because I just think it answers a lot of questions, as most of your books do, Laird. But this is more all-encompassing, I think, because it just explains a lot of mysteries in this part of the world. But it's wonderful, Laird. Laird, we obviously Amazon.com for the book and Intertraditions, and I think, you know, if you have any final thoughts, just leave it at that.
We can actually, yes, those are the proper outlets. The books can be purchased pretty much through any bookstore. Simon & Schuster, there's an author page for me. Also, I think that they may be the parent company of Intertraditions.
Ah, okay.
But I'm really looking forward to seeing you. I'm very pleased that my adult son Isaac, who also is heavily into a lot of these ideas, will be along with us. I think that he will add to what we see and what we are able to interpret, and I think you'll appreciate getting to know him also.
For sure. Looking forward to seeing Isaac too. I'm glad you mentioned. It's is Isaac going to follow in the footsteps of the father?
Hard to say. He wrote the foreword for my previous book called Point of Origin. Mm-hmm. He has areas of research that are entirely his own. He asks questions that point me in the right direction of things fairly often. So that's hard to say. He certainly has an interest. He's certainly connected to a lot of the same kinds of sources.
Wow,
so,
wonderful.
Forward to learning from the researchers there. You know, these are people whose work I've followed from a distance, and to have an opportunity to meet them is wonderful.
Yeah, that's the Megalithic Odyssey Symposium, and I guess it's like a think tank, Laird, and I that's what I love about shows like this. And it's been too long since we spoke anyway, but I know you've got this book coming out. I think the timing is perfect, and I think this show is like a think tank for me. And I feel selfish sometimes because I get so much out of it, and I know it's for the audience. So, but it's why I do what I do. I'm passionate about this subject matter, and I think that the origins of civilization is a very fundamental question, Laird, that everybody should seek. Because if you look at the political disarray on the planet at the moment, Laird, I mean, it's getting worse. I don't think it's getting better, and it may sound negative, but that's the reality of it. But I think
I agree.
I think people should question who they are in the past and understand it from a global perspective. I don't think there would be as many wars or religious, doctrines dominating.
No, I agree completely, and this is a wonderful time to be looking into topics of origins. But there certainly is a vibrant set of researchers who are doing that.
Sure. Of course, Laird, you've touched on the Dogon before, and we're going to bring in this aspect, but I get Vedic, Chinese, Polynesian, and other world cosmologies. And if you want to understand civilizations from truthful, alternative perspective, you need to come across Laird Scranton's research. Of course, Laird is probably most famous for the Dogon of all, I think, pioneering a massive wealth of research into the Dogon, which is how I think we've first come across Laird on Capricorn Radio. So I guess without further ado, let's bring on our guest. He is waiting. Hi, Laird. You're very welcome back to the show.
Hey, James. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me back on again, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you this August in the British Isles, which will be a unique experience for me.
Yeah, for sure, brother. It's great to have you over this side of the world, and yeah, and looking, we've got a big conference in Avebury, Megalithic Heartland in Marlborough in Wiltshire. We're going to have lots of interesting megalithic researchers from all different angles, and it's like a pooling of information together, and I think the time is right for all this. I know we have another guy, Crichton Miller there, and I think it gels a lot with your own research, that the seafaring thing, which I guess we'll probably touch a bit later in the show.
That's great. I'm looking.
And we are going to be talking about a super exciting topic with an overlay into my own personal research, which I love. Megaliths is a wonderful, ever-giving subject of research for me, and it's great to be having somebody like Laird on the case over this part of the world. We're going to get into Skara Brae, Neolithic settlement, megaliths up in the north of Scotland, and that's Laird's forthcoming book. But to do Laird justice, as always, to a little bit of biography on him before I bring him on. He's an independent researcher of ancient cosmology and language, and his comparative cosmology studies have served to synchronize aspects of African, Egyptian...
The era of 3200 BC, they were Egyptian, and they've done a very good job of preserving traditions. And I thought that if I had a shot of understanding Skara Brae, that it would be through comparison to the Dogon. If there had been Egyptian influences, I might see it in the Dogon. And so I didn't have great hopes when I started researching that I would find any connection whatsoever. That wasn't really my expectation. But as I got into looking at the situation, I realized there's not very much evidence to even begin with at Skara Brae. That it's fairly limited, but it doesn't connect to anything locally. I mean, the language and the pottery and the architecture and so on doesn't really connect to Scandinavian or local roots around the region of Scotland. You have place names that don't have linguistic roots, and you've got artifacts that don't really connect. And so I started sorting through. My first approach was to look at architectural forms. I know that the Skara Brae village, looked at in overview, is comparable to a Dogon village. I mean, it's theoretically possible they could have fallen in the same ballpark of architecture.
That's why the migration up to North Scotland, for me, for maybe other reasons, all roads head to the Orkneys, and that's just in terms of megalithic art, because there's something special going on up there. But for you, Laird, why the migration up there for the research? It's in the middle of nowhere, Laird. People don't even know where this is.
No, I had no knowledge of the Orkney Island region myself. It really came out of a single question from a distant email contact who wanted to know if I thought there might be Egyptian influences at Skara Brae. And from my standpoint, 3200 BC, which is the era of Skara Brae, is too early to realistically have reflected Egyptian influences. That's pre-dynastic Egypt. Culture in Egypt wasn't coherent enough to really support the idea that they might have made excursions as far away as Scotland and were, exerting influences that far away at 3200 BC. But
sorry, I was going to say maybe the other way around, though, Laird.
Right. Well, my first perspective was that I know that the Dogon tribe, the African tribe from Mali that I've studied, indications are that in the